The letter arrived at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology on a frost-bitten morning in January 1897, written in the shaking hand of a mill foreman who apologized 3 times for his poor penmanship before getting to the point. He described a colored cleaning woman's daughter, approximately 13 years old, who had been discovered late one night in the Institute's engineering laboratory, standing before a blackboard covered in equations that the faculty had left unsolved for 3 weeks. The girl had completed the proof. Not copied it from somewhere, not stumbled upon the answer by accident, but had worked through 17 steps of advanced calculus and theoretical mechanics that graduate students couldn't solve, using methods that didn't exist in any textbook. The foreman, a practical man named Thomas Hendricks, had found her there at 2 in the morning during his security rounds, chalk dust on her dark fingers, tears streaming down her face. When he demanded to know what she was doing, she'd whispered, "I'm sorry, sir. I'm so sorry. I just needed to fix it. The mathematics was wrong, and it was hurting my head to look at it broken like that." Professor Harrison Webb, head of MIT's Department of Applied Mathematics, had received hundreds of letters in his 30-year career claiming miraculous discoveries or impossible achievements. He burned most of them without reading past the first paragraph. But something about this particular letter, perhaps the foreman's obvious discomfort with his own claims, perhaps the specific details of the equations involved, made Webb pause. He knew those equations. His doctoral students had been wrestling with them for weeks, attempting to prove a theoretical framework for calculating tensile stress in suspension bridge cables under variable wind conditions. The mathematics required understanding of differential calculus, physics, materials science, and engineering principles that took years of university education to grasp. The idea that a colored child, presumably illiterate, daughter of a cleaning woman, could solve what his best students couldn't was absurd on its face. And yet, Thomas Hendricks had copied the girl's work from the blackboard before erasing it, following procedure to clear the board each night. The solution was included with his letter, written out in Hendricks' careful block letters. Webb checked it that afternoon, then checked it again that evening, then brought it to 2 colleagues the following morning. The proof was correct. Not just correct, but elegant. It used an approach that none of the faculty had considered, a way of visualizing the problem that somehow simplified what they'd been overcomplicating. Whoever had written this understood mathematics at a level that exceeded mere computation. This was genuine mathematical intuition, the kind that couldn't be taught, only discovered in those rare minds that could see the invisible architecture of numbers and forces. Professor Webb departed for Boston's South End the following week, bringing with him a notebook, a pencil, and a deep skepticism that was already beginning to crack. Before we continue with what happened when Webb found Lydia Johnson and her mother in their boarding house room, I want to ask you something. If you're fascinated by the buried stories of brilliance that challenged everything we thought we knew about who deserves to be called genius, subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling me what historical mystery you'd like us to explore next. I'm building something special here, a community that refuses to let these voices stay silent. Now, let me tell you what Professor Webb discovered in that freezing boarding house, and why it would ultimately destroy everything he believed about the human mind. The South End in 1897 was where Boston kept the people it needed but didn't want to see. Irish immigrants crowded into tenements alongside freed slaves and their children, all of them working the jobs that kept the city functioning while living in conditions that kept them invisible. The boarding house, where Lydia Johnson lived with her mother, Clara, stood on a narrow street that never saw direct sunlight, 4 stories of water-stained brick and broken shutters, the smell of coal smoke and boiled cabbage hanging in the stairwells like a permanent fog. Webb climbed to the 3rd floor, his expensive coat drawing suspicious stares from residents who recognized the uniform of someone from a different world. He found the room number that Hendricks had provided and knocked, feeling acutely aware of how inappropriate this visit was. A white professor, unmarried, calling on a colored woman and her child in a boarding house. If word reached the Institute's Board of Trustees, there would be questions. But curiosity had overwhelmed propriety, that dangerous itch that drives men of science to peer into places they've been told not to look. The woman who opened the door was perhaps 35, her face worn in the way that comes from years of physical labor and worry that never stops. She wore a plain grey dress, patched carefully at the elbows, her hair wrapped in a faded blue cloth. When she saw Webb, something like fear flickered across her features before she controlled it, replacing it with the careful neutrality that colored people had learned to show white authority. "Ma'am, I'm Professor Harrison Webb from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I'm looking for Mrs. Clara Johnson." "I'm Clara Johnson, sir." Her voice was quiet, expectant of bad news because that's what visits from white men usually brought. "Is your daughter here? Miss Lydia Johnson?" Clara's hand tightened on the doorframe. "What's this about? Is she in trouble?" "Sir, if she did something wrong at the Institute, I promise she won't go back. I told her to stay in the storage room while I clean, to not touch anything, but sometimes she wanders. Children get curious. It won't happen again. She's not in trouble, Mrs. Johnson. Quite the opposite. I need to speak with her about something she did. Something she did." Those words seemed to drain the remaining color from Clara's face. She stepped back, opening the door wider, resigned to whatever consequences were coming. The room was small, perhaps 12 feet square, with a single window that looked out onto a brick wall. A narrow bed stood against one wall, a small table with 2 mismatched chairs occupied the center, and in the corner, a pile of blankets on the floor suggested where the child slept. The space was spotlessly clean, the poverty absolute but dignified. A colored girl sat at the table, her attention focused on something in her lap. She was small for 13, her frame thin in a way that spoke of meals often skipped so her mother could eat. Her skin was dark brown, her hair plaited tightly against her skull, her dress a faded calico that had been let out multiple times as she grew. When she looked up at Webb, he saw her eyes, wide and dark, and containing something that made him profoundly uncomfortable. They were eyes that looked at him and through him simultaneously, eyes that seemed to be calculating something he couldn't perceive. "Lydia, this is Professor Webb from MIT. He wants to talk to you." Clara's voice carried a warning underneath. "Be respectful, be small, don't give them reasons." "Good afternoon, sir." Lydia's voice was barely above a whisper. She stood, setting aside what she'd been holding, a piece of newspaper that she'd been studying. Webb moved closer, curious. The newspaper page showed an advertisement for agricultural equipment, but Lydia had covered the margins with tiny mathematical notations, numbers and symbols written in pencil so small they were barely legible. "Miss Johnson, I want to ask you about something that happened last Tuesday night at the Institute. The foreman, Mr. Hendricks, found you in one of our laboratories. Do you remember?" Lydia's gaze dropped to the floor. "Yes, sir." "I'm sorry, sir. I know I shouldn't have been there. What were you doing?" "I was looking at the blackboard, sir. The one with the bridge equations." "Why?" The question seemed to confuse her, as if the answer was obvious. "Because they were wrong, sir. The professors had made a mistake in the 3rd step, and everything after that was wrong because of it. It was like a building with a broken foundation. I could see it was going to collapse." Webb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "You could see the error?" "Yes, sir." "Can you explain what was wrong?" Lydia glanced at her mother, seeking permission. Clara nodded slightly, though her expression suggested she had no idea what her daughter was about to say. "The professors were treating the wind force as if it came from a single direction, but wind doesn't work like that. It spirals and changes, so you can't use a simple vector. You have to account for the rotation and the time variance. I've watched wind move through the city. I've seen how it pushes against buildings and bridges. It's not simple. It's complex." She said this as if describing something she could see in front of her, as if the mathematics of wind and force were visible phenomena that anyone could observe if they just looked properly. Webb pulled out his notebook. "Miss Johnson, I'm going to write down some problems. I want you to look at them and tell me if you can solve them. Over the next 2 hours, In that freezing boarding house room, Harrison Webb conducted what would become one of the most significant intellectual examinations of the 19th century. He started with simple arithmetic, problems that any educated 12-year-old could handle. Lydia solved them instantly, barely glancing at the paper. He progressed to algebra, then geometry, then trigonometry. She worked through everything without hesitation, often providing answers before he finished writing the problems. Her methods were sometimes unconventional, approaches that Webb had never seen before, but her answers were flawless. Then he moved into advanced mathematics, calculus, differential equations, complex theoretical problems that his graduate students struggled with. Lydia's pace never slowed. She would look at a problem. Her eyes would track across the numbers in a way that suggested she was seeing something beyond the symbols themselves, and then she would provide the solution. Sometimes he would ask if she could show him how she saw it, and when he agreed, she would draw strange diagrams, visual representations of mathematical relationships that were simultaneously alien and perfectly logical. "Where did you learn this?" Webb asked, after she'd correctly solved a problem in fluid dynamics that had taken him 2 days to work through when he was a doctoral student. "I didn't learn it, sir. I just see it." "What do you mean you see it?" Lydia struggled to explain, her young voice searching for words to describe something that shouldn't be possible. "When I look at numbers, sir, I don't see what other people see. I see shapes, patterns. Mathematics isn't symbols on paper for me. It's like architecture in my head. I can see how numbers fit together, how forces balance, how systems work. When I look at an equation, I'm seeing the shape of what it's describing. The bridge problem. I could see the bridge in my head, see the forces acting on it, see how the mathematics had to bend to match the reality of the structure. Does that make sense?" It made no sense. It made terrible, revolutionary sense. Webb had heard of savants, individuals with highly specific talents, calculating prodigies who could multiply enormous numbers in their heads but couldn't understand why the calculations worked. But Lydia wasn't a savant. She understood the underlying principles. She could explain her reasoning. She could apply her abilities to novel problems. This wasn't idiot savant syndrome. This was genuine, profound mathematical genius, the kind that appeared perhaps once in a generation, and it had manifested in a colored girl living in poverty, daughter of a cleaning woman, who had somehow taught herself advanced mathematics simply by observing the world around her. "How do you know about physics, about engineering?" Webb asked. "From watching, sir. Mama cleans at MIT 5 nights a week. I go with her because she can't leave me alone here. It's not safe. I'm supposed to stay in the supply closet while she works. But sometimes I walk around when the buildings are empty. I look at the blackboards. I read the books left open on desks. I watch how things work, how machines move, how bridges hold weight, and I see the mathematics underneath it all. It's like the world is made of numbers and forces, and I can see the equations that make everything happen." Clara had been standing silently by the door, watching her daughter with an expression of fear and pride intertwined. Now she spoke, her voice strained. "Is she wrong in the head, Professor? The other mothers, they say she's strange, that it's not natural for a child to think the way she does. I've been worried, sir, that something's not right with her." Webb looked at this woman who had no education herself, who worked brutal hours cleaning other people's dirt, who was asking if her daughter's brilliance was a disease. "Mrs. Johnson, your daughter is not wrong in the head. She's extraordinary. She has abilities that I've never encountered in my entire career. She's solving problems that trained mathematicians can't solve. She's understanding concepts that require years of university education to grasp, and she's doing it naturally, as if her mind operates on a different level than the rest of us." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Is that good or bad, sir?" And there was the question, wasn't it? In a world that believed colored people were intellectually inferior, that used that supposed inferiority to justify segregation and disenfranchisement, that built its entire social hierarchy on the assumption that people like Clara and Lydia Johnson were fundamentally less capable than white people, What did it mean to discover a colored child whose abilities exceeded those of the most educated white men? Was that good or bad? I don't know, Webb admitted. But I need to understand it. I need to test her more extensively, document her abilities, try to understand how her mind works. Will it help her? Clara asked, cutting through all the scientific fascination to the only question that mattered to a mother. Will whatever you do help my daughter have a better life? Webb wanted to say yes. He wanted to promise that revealing Lydia's abilities would open doors, would prove to the world that intelligence had no color, would force society to acknowledge that its racial theories were lies. But he'd lived in this world long enough to know better. I honestly don't know, Mrs. Johnson, but I can promise you this: I will do everything in my power to ensure that she's protected, that she's not exploited, that her abilities are used to help her, not to harm her. Clara looked at her daughter, at this child who saw the world in equations, who had been blessed or cursed with a mind that wouldn't stop calculating. Lydia, baby, what do you want? Lydia's answer was simple, devastating in its simplicity. I want to learn, Mama. I want to understand more. The mathematics I can see, it's like I'm looking at a book with half the pages missing. I can see some of it, but there's so much more I know exists, but can't see yet because I haven't learned the language for it. I want to know the rest. How could a mother deny her child that? How could anyone who claimed to care about knowledge and truth deny a mind like this the chance to develop? All right, Clara said finally. But Professor Webb, if this goes wrong, if they hurt her or use her or try to take her from me, I'll run. I'll take her and we'll disappear, and you'll never find us. You understand? I understand. 1. Webb returned to MIT and immediately wrote to 3 colleagues whose judgment he trusted, asking them to come to Boston to verify what he'd found. Within 2 weeks, 3 of America's leading mathematicians had made the journey to that boarding house room. All 3 emerged shaken, convinced, unable to explain what they'd witnessed. Lydia Johnson could solve any mathematical problem they presented. She could visualize complex spatial relationships. She could understand abstract theoretical concepts that shouldn't be accessible to someone without formal training. And perhaps most remarkable, she could extend existing theories, suggesting new approaches and methods that, when the professors checked them later, proved to be valid innovations. She wasn't just mimicking or memorizing, she was creating, genuinely advancing mathematical thought. By February, word had begun to spread through academic circles. Not publicly, not yet, but in the careful correspondence between scholars, the whispered conversations at conferences. There's a colored girl in Boston. Webb found her. You have to see it to believe it. And with that spreading awareness came the inevitable question that would define everything that followed. What do we do with her? MIT's Board of Trustees met in emergency session on February 18th, 1897. Professor Webb presented his findings, bringing with him documentation of Lydia's abilities, testimonials from the visiting mathematicians, and a proposal. The Institute should provide Lydia with formal education, perhaps a special tutorial arrangement, since admitting a colored female student would be impossible given current policies. They should study her, yes, but gently, respectfully, in ways that would help her develop her abilities while protecting her from exploitation. The board's response was more complicated than Webb had anticipated. Half the trustees saw Lydia as a scientific opportunity, a chance to understand the origins of mathematical genius, potentially to prove that intelligence transcended race. The other half saw her as a problem. If word got out that a Negro child was intellectually superior to white graduates of MIT, it would challenge everything that justified the current social order. It would be ammunition for integrationists, for those radicals who wanted to overthrow segregation and force racial mixing. It would embarrass the Institute, raise questions about their admissions policies, potentially alienate Southern donors and students. The compromise they reached satisfied no one. Lydia would be allowed to study at MIT, but only in complete secrecy. She would come at night when no students were present. She would work with select professors who understood the sensitivity of the situation. Under no circumstances would her existence be publicly acknowledged. She would be a ghost, a shadow, permitted to learn but forbidden to exist officially. Webb agreed because it was better than nothing. Clara agreed because her daughter would finally get the education she'd been desperate for. Lydia agreed because she didn't yet understand that being brilliant and colored and female in 1897 America meant that her mind would always be treated as either a threat to be suppressed or a curiosity to be studied, but never simply as a person with gifts to be nurtured. The arrangement began in March. 3 nights a week, after Clara finished her cleaning work, Lydia would enter the mathematics building through a service entrance and make her way to a small classroom where Webb and occasionally other faculty members would wait. They would present her with problems, teach her formal mathematical language for concepts she already understood intuitively, and watch in awe as she absorbed years of education in weeks. She learned calculus in a month, differential equations in 2 weeks, theoretical physics in 6 weeks. She read Newton's Principia and found errors that had gone unnoticed for 2 centuries. She looked at emerging work on electromagnetism and suggested modifications to Maxwell's equations that predicted phenomena that wouldn't be experimentally verified for another decade. She was, quite simply, the most remarkable mathematical mind that any of them had ever encountered, and she was forbidden to exist. But secrets like this don't stay secret. By April, rumors had reached beyond academic circles. A reporter from the Boston Globe, following whispers about strange nighttime activities at MIT, began asking questions. Southern newspapers, always alert to anything that might challenge racial hierarchies, picked up the story in garbled form. Reports of Negro genius in the North, probably abolitionist propaganda, probably a hoax. Scientific journals began receiving letters demanding clarification. And, in Virginia, a man named Dr. Marcus Thorne, who had built his career on craniometric research, proving Negro intellectual inferiority, read about Lydia Johnson and became obsessed with disproving her existence. Thorne was 53 years old, a physician by training, a racial theorist by passion. He had published extensively on skull measurements, brain weights, facial angles, all the pseudo-scientific apparatus that white supremacy had dressed in the clothes of objective research. His work was cited in legal decisions upholding segregation, in political speeches justifying disenfranchisement, in popular books explaining why racial hierarchy was natural and inevitable. And now this girl in Boston threatened to demolish everything he'd built. If a Negro child could demonstrate mathematical abilities superior to educated white men, then the fundamental premise of racial science, that intelligence was biologically determined by race, was false. Thorne couldn't allow that. He wrote to MIT's Board of Trustees demanding access to examine Lydia, to verify her abilities, to determine whether this was genuine genius or some elaborate trick. His letter carried an implicit threat. If MIT refused to allow proper scientific examination, Thorne would publicly claim they were perpetrating a fraud, using a trained child to manufacture false evidence of Negro intelligence for political purposes. The board, trapped between competing pressures, made another compromise. They would allow a controlled examination by a panel of outside scientists, including Thorne, to verify Lydia's abilities and determine their significance. Webb argued against this. He'd read Thorne's work, he knew the man's agenda, but the board overruled him. Better to allow the examination and let the truth speak for itself than to appear to be hiding something. The examination was scheduled for May 15th, 1897, and Professor Harrison Webb, who had discovered Lydia Johnson and promised to protect her, could feel control of the situation slipping from his hands, could sense that something terrible was approaching, something he would be powerless to prevent. But he had no idea just how terrible it would become, or how far men would go to suppress a truth that threatened their entire worldview. And that is where we must pause. The examination room they chose was on MIT's third floor, a space normally used for advanced laboratory work, now cleared of equipment and arranged like a courtroom. A long table at one end seated the examination panel. Dr. Marcus Thorne from Virginia, Dr. Edmund Cartwright from Yale's Department of Psychology, Professor Lawrence Hamilton from Harvard's Medical School, and two representatives from MIT's own faculty. Professor Webb sat to the side, technically present as an observer, practically powerless. At the room's center stood a smaller desk, a single chair, and nothing else. This is where Lydia would sit, isolated, visible from all angles, subject to scrutiny from every direction. Lydia Johnson waited outside in the hallway, forbidden from entering. The board had decided that her presence might somehow influence the examination, as if a cleaning woman could secretly signal advanced mathematical solutions to her daughter. When Lydia entered, escorted by a stern-faced administrator, the 5 men at the table fell silent, studying her with the clinical detachment they might apply to an unusual specimen under glass. She wore her best dress, which was still worn and patched, her hair plaited so tightly it pulled at her scalp. She was 13 years old, barely 5 feet tall, 70 pounds at most, walking into a room full of white men who had the power to define her entire existence. Webb watched her face, looking for fear, but what he saw instead was that strange analytical expression she wore when confronting a mathematical problem, as if she was calculating the dimensions of the trap she'd walked into. "Sit down, girl," Thorne said, not bothering with her name. Lydia sat, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight despite the chair being slightly too large for her frame. Thorne opened a leather folder, withdrawing several pages of notes. "We are here to conduct a scientific examination of the claims made regarding your supposed intellectual abilities. You will answer our questions truthfully and completely. You will solve the problems we present. You will submit to physical examination if required. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Let us begin with basic questions to establish your background. Can you read?" "Yes, sir." "Who taught you?" "I taught myself, sir. By looking at books and newspapers, matching the words to sounds I knew." "You expect us to believe you simply taught yourself to read with no instruction?" "I don't expect anything, sir. You asked me a question and I answered it truthfully." There was something in her tone, not quite defiance, but an absence of the submission that Thorne expected from colored children. His jaw tightened slightly. "Can you write?" "Yes, sir." "Demonstrate." They provided her with paper and pen. Lydia wrote her name, then a sentence Thorne dictated. "The examination of racial characteristics requires objective scientific methodology." Her handwriting was careful, slightly cramped. The letters formed with precision, if not elegance. Thorne examined the paper, then passed it to his colleagues. "Adequate," he said dismissively, as if grudging even this minor acknowledgement. "Now, we will proceed to mathematical assessment. Dr. Cartwright will present the first problem." Cartwright was younger than Thorne, perhaps 40, with the bland handsomeness of someone who had never encountered serious opposition to his views. He opened his own folder, selected a page, and read aloud. "A train leaves Boston, traveling west at 40 miles per hour. 2 hours later, a second train leaves Boston, traveling west at 60 miles per hour. How long will it take the second train to overtake the first?" It was a problem that any decent student of algebra could solve, the kind of question designed to establish baseline competence. Lydia answered, before Cartwright finished reading. 3 hours, Cartwright blinked. "You need to show your work. The first train travels for 2 hours before the second train starts, covering 80 miles. The second train is 20 miles per hour faster, so it closes the gap at 20 miles per hour. 80 divided by 20 equals 4 hours of travel time for the second train, but you asked how long after the second train departs, so it's 3 hours. Cartwright checked his notes. "That's correct, but you should write out the equations. If you want me to write them, I will, sir. But you asked for the answer, and I gave it to you." The examination continued for the next hour, progressing through increasingly difficult mathematics, algebra, geometry, trigonometry, calculus. Each time, Lydia would listen to the problem, sometimes ask for clarification of what exactly they wanted her to find, then provide the answer with minimal delay. The panel began glancing at each other, the kind of looks that pass between people who are witnessing something they can't quite process. Webb watched Thorne's expression shift from confident superiority to confusion to something darker, anger perhaps, or fear. Around the second hour, Thorne took over the questioning directly. "These are parlor tricks," he announced. "Memorization and training. The girl has been coached to perform these calculations. We need to test genuine understanding, not rote responses." He withdrew a different set of papers, problems he'd prepared specifically for this examination, complex theoretical questions that couldn't be solved through memorization because they required real understanding of underlying principles. Here is a problem in advanced mechanics. A bridge span of 200 feet is supported by cables arranged in a parabolic curve. Given the following specifications for cable tension, deck weight, and load distribution, calculate the maximum safe load the bridge can support under sustained wind pressure of 30 miles per hour. He read out a series of specifications, numbers and measurements that would take even a trained engineer time to organize and understand. Lydia listened, her eyes tracking slightly, as if following invisible calculations in the air in front of her. "Sir, I need to clarify something before I answer." "What?" "Are you asking for theoretical maximum load based on the cable specifications alone, or practical maximum load accounting for deck stress distribution and connection point failure risks?" Thorne stared at her. "Explain the difference. The cables themselves might be able to support a certain weight, but if that weight is distributed unevenly, or if the connection points where the cables attached to the deck aren't reinforced properly, the bridge will fail at a lower load than the cables alone could theoretically handle. Engineering isn't just about individual components, it's about how systems interact. So which calculation do you want?" The question demonstrated understanding that went beyond simple mathematics. This was systems thinking, the ability to see how multiple factors interacted, the kind of conceptual sophistication that separated competent engineers from brilliant ones. "Both," Thorne said finally. "Give me both calculations." Lydia closed her eyes for perhaps 30 seconds, her lips moving slightly as if speaking to herself. Then she opened them and began to recite numbers, explaining her methodology as she went, describing how she was visualizing the bridge structure, how she was accounting for force distribution, how she was calculating stress factors at critical points. She provided two numbers, one for theoretical maximum based on cable strength alone, another lower number for practical maximum, accounting for system vulnerabilities. The panel sat in stunned silence. Finally, Hamilton from Harvard spoke up. "Dr. Thorne, do you have the solutions to these problems?" "Of course." "Are her answers correct?" Thorne checked his notes, taking longer than necessary, clearly hoping to find an error. His face darkened as he compared Lydia's answers to his own calculations. "The first answer is correct. The second answer uses a methodology I hadn't considered, but appears to be valid." "Appears to be?" Webb couldn't stay silent any longer. "Either the mathematics is sound or it isn't. The mathematics may be sound, but that doesn't prove she derived it independently. She could have been taught these specific problems." "Then give her a problem she hasn't seen," Webb shot back. "Give her something original, something you create right now that couldn't possibly have been anticipated." Thorne's expression suggested this was exactly what he wanted. He stood, moving to the blackboard mounted on one wall, and began writing. He spent 15 minutes constructing a problem, a complex scenario involving fluid dynamics, pressure calculations, and three-dimensional spatial reasoning. It was the kind of problem that would appear in an advanced physics examination, the kind that graduate students would spend an hour solving with access to reference books and calculation tools. When he finished, he turned to Lydia. "Solve this." She studied the board for several minutes, her head tilting slightly, that strange, unfocused gaze, suggesting she was seeing something beyond the symbols written in chalk. Then she stood, walked to the board and asked, "May I show my work here, sir?" "Please do." What followed was, for Webb, one of the most remarkable demonstrations of mathematical thinking he had ever witnessed. Lydia didn't just solve the problem, she restructured it, finding a more elegant approach than the one Thorne had anticipated, using visual representations that made complex relationships suddenly clear. She drew diagrams showing force vectors. She noted simplifying assumptions that could be made without sacrificing accuracy. She caught an error in Thorne's original setup, where he'd accidentally used the wrong unit conversion. And she explained everything in simple language, teaching as she solved, making her thinking visible and comprehensible. When she finished, she set down the chalk and returned to her seat, leaving the board covered in her work. The room was silent except for the sound of breathing and the distant noise of the city outside. Professor Hamilton rose and approached the board, examining Lydia's work closely. He traced her logic, checked her calculations, studied her diagrams. Finally, he turned to face his colleagues. "Gentlemen, I don't know how to say this delicately, so I'll be blunt. This is legitimate genius. This isn't training or memorization or some kind of trick. This girl understands advanced mathematics at a level that I rarely see in doctoral candidates. She's not just solving problems, she's demonstrating genuine creative mathematical thinking." "Impossible," Thorne said flatly. "There must be some explanation. Some technique she's using to create the illusion of understanding." "What explanation do you propose?" Hamilton challenged. "That Professor Webb spent months training her to solve thousands of potential problems so she could perform on demand? That she somehow memorized approaches to problems she'd never seen? Be reasonable, Marcus. Sometimes the evidence forces us to revise our theories. My theories are based on decades of craniometric research, on measurements of thousands of specimens, on documented biological differences between the races. Then perhaps your theories are wrong." The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Thorne's face flushed red, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I will not have my life's work dismissed because of some anomaly. Science is about understanding the general rule, not being distracted by outliers." "She's not an outlier," Webb interjected. "Or rather, she is, but not in the way you think. She's an outlier in human cognition generally, not in Negro cognition specifically. What she proves is that the capacity for this kind of genius exists across racial lines, that our theories about fixed racial intellectual hierarchies are built on false premises." "You want to overturn the entire scientific establishment based on one girl?" Thorne demanded. "I want to acknowledge the truth based on the evidence in front of us. Isn't that what science is supposed to be?" The examination continued for another 3 hours, but the battle lines had been drawn. Hamilton and Cartwright, though clearly unsettled by the implications, acknowledged that Lydia's abilities were genuine and extraordinary. The two MIT representatives hedged, suggesting more study was needed before drawing conclusions. And Thorne became increasingly hostile, his questions taking on an edge that moved from scientific inquiry toward interrogation. He demanded Lydia solve problems in her head without writing anything down, then accused her of using some kind of memory technique when she succeeded. He presented deliberately unsolvable problems with contradictory specifications, then accused her of being uncooperative when she pointed out the logical impossibilities. He began asking questions designed not to test her abilities but to humiliate her, asking about her living conditions, her mother's work, whether she'd ever stolen books or sneaked into places she wasn't allowed. "Sir," Lydia said finally, her voice still quiet, but carrying a hint of steel underneath, "are you examining my mathematical abilities, or are you trying to prove I'm a bad person who doesn't deserve to have them? I'm trying to determine whether you understand the significance of what's being claimed about you. Do you realize that if we acknowledge your abilities as genuine, it would challenge fundamental theories about racial capacity? I know what you believe about people who look like me, sir. I've heard it my whole life. I've been told I'm inferior, that my brain is smaller, that I'm suited only for manual labor, but mathematics doesn't care what you believe. 2 + 2 = 4, whether a white man or a colored girl says it. The bridge equations don't change based on who's solving them. Truth exists independently of who's convenient for it to exist for. The room went dead silent. A 13-year-old Negro girl had just lectured a panel of white scientists about objective truth, and she'd done it with such simple logic that there was no immediate rebuttal. Thorne's face went through several shades of red. "You're impertinent." "I'm honest, sir. You asked me a question and I answered it. You need to learn your place. I thought my place was sitting in this chair solving whatever problems you gave me. That's what Professor Webb told me this examination was for. If you wanted me to be quiet and submissive, you should have said that was being tested too." Webb wanted to applaud and shout at her simultaneously. She was right, devastatingly right, but she was also a colored child, speaking to white men with authority, and that was dangerous in ways that mathematics couldn't protect her from. Hamilton cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess. This has been an intensive examination, and I think we all need to collect our thoughts before proceeding to physical measurements." Physical measurements. Webb's stomach dropped. He'd been dreading this part. Craniometry, the measurement of skull size and shape, was considered essential to any scientific examination of intelligence in 1897. Thorne would want to measure Lydia's head, compare her skull dimensions to his charts and tables, try to find some physical explanation for her abilities that didn't threaten his theories about racial hierarchy. And there was no good outcome. If her skull measurements were unremarkable, Thorne would use that to argue her abilities must be fraudulent because genuine intelligence required certain physical characteristics. If her measurements were unusual, she'd become a specimen to be studied, poked, prodded, possibly even subjected to more invasive examinations. During the recess, Webb found Clara in the hallway. She stood when she saw him, her face tight with worry. "How is she?" "Holding her own. She's brilliant, Clara. She's proving everything we knew about her abilities, but that's making it worse in some ways." "What do you mean?" "Half the men in there are convinced she's extraordinary. The other half are terrified of what that means, and frightened men are dangerous." Clara grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Professor Webb, if they try to hurt her, if they try to take her from me, you have to help us get away. I can't let them turn my baby into some kind of exhibit. It won't come to that. You can't promise that. You're a good man, Professor, I can tell. But you're one person, and they're the whole world. If the whole world decides it needs to suppress what Lydia is, what can one good man do?" It was the question that would haunt Webb for the rest of his life. When they reconvened, Thorne had regained his composure, though his eyes held something cold and calculating. "We need to proceed to anthropometric measurements. Standard craniometric protocol." He withdrew a set of calipers from his bag, metal instruments designed to measure skull dimensions with precision. "Miss Johnson, if you would stand and come here." Lydia looked at Webb, seeking some signal about whether this was safe. He had no signal to give her. She stood and approached Thorne, her small frame tense. "This won't hurt," Thorne said, though his tone suggested he didn't particularly care whether it did. "I'm going to measure various aspects of your skull structure. Hold still." He positioned the calipers against her head, measuring from different angles, calling out numbers that Cartwright recorded in a notebook. Maximum cranial length, cranial breadth, cranial height, facial measurements, angles and proportions. The process took 20 minutes, during which Lydia stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on some distant point, her jaw clenched. When Thorne finished, he studied his notes with an expression of deep frustration. "The measurements are within normal ranges for her age and sex. Cranial capacity appears adequate, though of course we cannot determine brain weight without dissection." The casual mention of dissection, as if Lydia were already a corpse to be studied, made Webb's blood run cold. "That won't be necessary," he said sharply. "We're examining a living child, not preparing a cadaver for autopsy. Obviously, we cannot dissect a living subject," Thorne replied with exaggerated patience. "But it does limit our ability to draw definitive conclusions. I'm complicit in this. I need to see it through." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Why are you doing this? Really? You're a white man with position and respect. We're nothing to you. "You're not nothing. Your daughter is one of the most remarkable people I've ever known. And if I stand by and watch her be destroyed because acknowledging her brilliance is inconvenient, then everything I've claimed to believe about human dignity and truth and justice is a lie. I'd rather lose my career than live that lie." The days before June 24th moved with agonizing slowness. Harrison continued his normal teaching duties, maintaining the appearance that nothing was wrong, all while making quiet preparations. He withdrew his savings in cash, converted some to traveler's checks under a false name. He packed a bag with essentials, clothes, documents, funds. He wrote letters to colleagues, sealed and dated, to be opened only if he didn't return, letters explaining what he'd done and why. He said goodbye to his life because he understood that after June 24th, Professor Harrison Webb of MIT would cease to exist. He would become Harrison Miller, or John Collins, or whatever name they chose in Canada. He would become a fugitive, a kidnapper in the eyes of the law, a man who had thrown away respectability for principle. And he found that he was more at peace with that decision than he'd been with anything in his careful, respectable academic career. June 24th, 1897, arrived with the kind of perfect summer weather that feels obscene when you're planning something terrible and necessary. Harrison and Marcus met at 3 p.m. in a rented room 2 miles from Brightwater, going through the plan one final time, checking equipment, timing each step. They would approach the facility at 7:30, using the cover of dusk. They would wait near the east service entrance until 8:15, when Elizabeth triggered the alarm. Then they would move. At 8 p.m., they were in position, hidden in the tree line near Brightwater's eastern wall. Harrison could hear his own heartbeat, loud and irregular. He'd never done anything remotely like this, never broken a law more serious than overdue library books. Now he was preparing to break into a private facility, remove a child against state authority, flee across state lines. Every instinct of his ordered, academic life screamed that this was wrong, illegal, career-ending. And yet, sitting in those trees watching the sun sink behind Brightwater's stone walls, he knew with absolute certainty that it was right. At 8:14, Marcus checked his pocket watch. 1 minute. You remember the route? East entrance, 2nd floor service stairs, 3rd floor, left corridor, 5th door. If anything goes wrong, if we get separated, you run. Don't wait for me. Get the girl and run. I'm not leaving without her. I know. That's what worries me. You're a good man, Professor. But good men aren't always good at the kind of ugly necessities that the fire alarm exploded into sound, bells clanging throughout Brightwater, the noise carrying across the grounds. Marcus moved immediately, running low toward the service entrance. Harrison followed, his breath harsh in his throat, his legs clumsy with adrenaline. Marcus reached the door, pulled out lockpicks, worked for 30 seconds that felt like hours. The lock clicked. They were inside. The interior was chaos, exactly as hoped. Staff running toward the alarm, guards shouting questions, patients in some rooms crying out in confusion or fear. Harrison and Marcus moved against the flow, heading for the service stairs, while everyone else converged on the supposed fire. Up the stairs, legs burning, lungs aching. 2nd floor. Keep going. 3rd floor. The corridor stretched ahead, dim and institutional, doors on both sides. 5th door on the left. Harrison counted, his vision narrowing to that single objective. There. Room 307. He tried the handle. Locked. The keys, he gasped. Nurse's station. Marcus was already moving, 20 feet down the corridor, reaching the cabinet Elizabeth had described. He forced it open with a crowbar, grabbed a ring of keys, ran back. Tried the 1st key. Wrong. 2nd key. Wrong. 3rd key. The lock turned. The door opened. And Harrison Webb saw what had become of Lydia Johnson. She sat on the bed, curled into herself, her arms wrapped around her knees. She was thinner than when he'd last seen her, her face hollow, her eyes too large. She wore a plain institutional gown, grey and shapeless. When the door opened, She flinched, pressing herself against the wall, her expression showing pure terror before recognition slowly filtered through. "Professor Webb?" Her voice was hoarse, as if she hadn't used it properly in weeks. "Lydia, we're getting you out. Right now. Can you walk?" I don't understand. How are you?" "No time to explain. We have perhaps 3 minutes before they realize the alarm is false and start searching. Can you walk?" She nodded, standing unsteadily. Harrison moved to her, supporting her weight as they moved toward the door. Marcus was already in the corridor, checking both directions. "Clear. Move." They half walked, half carried Lydia toward the service stairs. Behind them, Harrison heard shouting, someone yelling that there was no fire, that it was a false alarm, that everyone should return to their stations. They reached the stairs and started down. "Second floor. Keep moving. First floor." The service entrance was ahead, the door they'd come through still unlocked. Almost there. Almost. A guard appeared at the end of the corridor, confused at first, then alarmed. "Hey, what are you doing with that patient?" Marcus didn't hesitate. He charged the guard, hitting him hard in the midsection, driving him back against the wall. The guard struggled, reaching for a whistle on his belt. Marcus hit him again, a vicious punch that dropped the man to the floor, unconscious or stunned. "Go," Marcus shouted. "I'll hold them here. Get her out." Harrison ran, supporting Lydia, bursting through the service entrance into the evening air. Behind them, whistles were blowing, voices shouting, the facility waking to the realization that someone had breached their security. He ran for the wall, pulling Lydia with him. She was gasping, her legs weak, but she kept moving, kept pushing herself. At the wall, Harrison interlaced his fingers. "Step here. I'll boost you over." She put her foot in his hands. He lifted, straining, getting her high enough to grab the top of the wall. She pulled herself up with strength that seemed impossible given her condition, driven by pure, desperate will. Then she was over, dropping down the other side. Harrison grabbed the wall's top edge, pulled himself up, his arms screaming. For a terrifying moment, he thought he couldn't do it, that he'd hang there until the guards caught up. Then, adrenaline gave him the strength he needed. He pulled himself over, dropped heavily on the other side, his ankle twisting painfully as he landed. Lydia grabbed his arm. "Come on." They ran into the trees, branches whipping at their faces, roots catching their feet. Behind them, Harrison heard guards at the wall, heard them climbing over. But the darkness and the dense forest gave them cover. They had perhaps a 2-minute lead. They ran for the road, for where Clara waited with the wagon. 200 yards. 100. 50. There, the road emerging from the trees, and there, the wagon, and there, Clara jumping down, her face transforming when she saw her daughter. "Mama!" Lydia's voice broke. She stumbled forward, falling into her mother's arms, both of them sobbing. "In the wagon," Harrison gasped. "Now, they're right behind us." Clara lifted Lydia into the wagon bed, climbed up after her. Harrison pulled himself onto the driver's bench, grabbed the reins, snapped them hard. The horse started forward, slow at first, then faster, pulling them away from Brightwater, away from the sounds of pursuit, away from the facility where they'd tried to break a brilliant child's mind. They drove through the night, changing roads frequently, heading generally northeast toward Connecticut. Every sound made Harrison jump, every distant rider made him think they were caught. But as hours passed and no pursuit materialized, he began to believe they might actually escape. At dawn, they reached the Safe House, a Quaker farm in northern Connecticut whose owners asked no questions. Clara and Lydia were given a room. Harrison collapsed in a chair, exhausted beyond anything he'd ever felt. But they'd done it. Against the machinery of law and institutional authority, against the power of men like Thorne, who controlled resources and respectability, they'd done it. They'd rescued one brilliant girl from captivity. Later that morning, as Clara tended to her daughter and Harrison tried to process everything that had happened, Lydia asked to speak with him privately. They sat in the farm's kitchen while Clara bathed upstairs, and Lydia looked at him with eyes that had aged years in the weeks since her abduction. "Professor Webb, I need to tell you what Dr. Thorne was planning. What he called the definitive test. You don't have to talk about that now. You're safe. You can rest. No. You need to know. You need to understand what you saved me from." She took a shaking breath. "He was going to perform surgery on my brain." Harrison felt the room tilt. "What?" He said it was the only way to definitively understand the source of my abilities. He said the measurements and tests were inconclusive, that the only way to prove whether my intelligence was genuine or aberrant was to examine my brain directly. He described the procedure in detail, how he would open my skull, remove sections of brain tissue for analysis, map the structures that might explain my abilities. He said I would likely die during or shortly after the surgery, but that was acceptable for the advancement of science. He said my sacrifice would help determine the truth about racial intelligence once and for all. She was crying now, silently, tears streaming down her face. He talked about it like he was being kind to me, like he was doing me a favor by making my death meaningful. He kept saying that surely I understood the importance of contributing to scientific knowledge, that this was my chance to matter, to be part of something larger than myself. And I realized that he genuinely believed it. He thought he was being reasonable, that killing me to study my brain was a legitimate scientific methodology. Because to him, I'm not a person. I'm a specimen. And specimens exist to be studied, no matter what it costs them. Harrison pulled her into an embrace, feeling her thin frame shaking against him. "He will never touch you again, I promise. We're taking you somewhere he can't reach you. You'll be free to learn and grow and become whatever you're capable of becoming. And he'll spend the rest of his life knowing that the evidence that proved him wrong escaped. Do you think he'll stop looking for me? I think he'll try to find you. But, Professor, the world is large, and we're going to make you disappear into it so thoroughly that Dr. Marcus Thorne will search for the rest of his life and never find you. You'll become a ghost story, the brilliant girl who vanished, the one who got away, and that will haunt him forever." For the first time since her rescue, Lydia smiled, a small, fierce expression that suggested that despite everything they'd done to her, despite all the weeks of isolation and examination and fear, they hadn't broken what mattered most. Her mind was still hers, her brilliance still burned, and now she would have the chance to see what she could become when given freedom instead of captivity, education instead of examination, humanity instead of being treated as a specimen. But the question that haunted all of them as they prepared for the final journey to Canada was whether escape was enough. Whether one girl's freedom meant anything if the system that had tried to destroy her remained intact, ready to do the same to the next brilliant child who threatened the comfortable lies that kept the racial hierarchy in place. And it's here, at this moment of successful escape but uncertain future, that we must pause again. They crossed into Canada on July 2nd, 1897, using forged documents that identified them as the Miller family. John Miller, a widowed schoolteacher from Vermont, his sister Clara Miller, and her daughter Sarah Miller, traveling to Toronto to take up a teaching position. The border guards barely glanced at them, 3 more Americans among thousands crossing for work or opportunity, or reasons they didn't care to explain. And just like that, Professor Harrison Webb ceased to exist. John Miller, with his small savings and his guilty conscience and his determination to see through what he'd started, took his place. Toronto in 1897 was a city transformed by migration. Thousands of freed slaves and their descendants had made their way north over the decades, creating communities that understood the necessity of protecting those who fled American injustice. The Millers, as they now called themselves, found rooms in one of these communities, a boarding house run by a woman named Margaret Hawthorne, whose own parents had escaped slavery via the Underground Railroad 50 years earlier. Margaret asked no questions about their past, required no explanations for the careful way they avoided giving details about where they'd come from or why they'd left. She'd seen enough refugees to recognize the signs, people who startled at unexpected knocks, who read newspapers with anxious attention to articles about fugitives and extradition, who kept bags packed near the door in case they needed to run again. She gave them space, offered quiet support, and connected them with others who might help. The first months were about survival and adjustment. Harrison, now John, found work tutoring the children of wealthy Toronto families, using his genuine mathematical expertise while carefully avoiding any mention of MIT or his academic credentials. The pay was modest but adequate. Clara found work as a seamstress, her cleaning days behind her, finally doing labor that didn't leave her exhausted and aching. And Lydia, now Sarah, slowly began to recover from the trauma of Brightwater. The physical recovery came first. Regular meals, rest, freedom from the constant stress of examination and confinement. She gained weight, her face filling out, color returning to her skin, but the psychological recovery took longer. She had nightmares that left her screaming, waking the entire boarding house. She couldn't tolerate locked doors, would panic if left alone in a closed room. She startled at footsteps in hallways, convinced that guards were coming, and she couldn't do mathematics. This was perhaps the most troubling symptom. When Harrison tried to continue her education, presenting her with problems that she would once have solved instantly, she would stare at the paper with rising panic, her breath quickening, her hands shaking. The mathematics that had once been her refuge, the one thing that made sense in a chaotic world, had been poisoned by association with Thorne's examinations. Every equation reminded her of the testing room at Brightwater. Every calculation brought back memories of being asked to perform, to prove her abilities, to demonstrate her value as a specimen. "I can't see it anymore," she told Harrison one evening, 3 months after their escape, tears of frustration streaming down her face. "The shapes, the patterns, the way numbers used to fit together in my head, it's like there's fog over everything. I look at a problem and I just see symbols on paper, not the architecture underneath. He broke something in me, Professor. Doctor. Thorne broke the part of my mind that could do the thing that made me special. You're still special, Lydia. Your mind is still remarkable. You're just traumatized. That's normal after what you experienced. But what if it doesn't come back? What if I lost it permanently? Then what was the point? We ran, you gave up everything, Mama lost her home, and for what? To save a girl who isn't even particularly smart anymore?" Harrison grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Listen to me carefully. Your value as a human being has nothing to do with your mathematical abilities. Nothing. You are worthwhile because you exist, because you're a person with thoughts and feelings and dignity, not because you can solve equations faster than other people. Even if you never do advanced mathematics again for the rest of your life still matters. You still matter. Do you understand?" She wanted to believe him, but she'd spent her entire life being told that her only value was in her exceptional abilities, that the only reason people like Professor Webb paid attention to her was because she could do things other people couldn't. Take away the mathematics and what was left? Just another colored girl in a world that had no use for colored girls. The breakthrough came in October, 4 months after their escape. Lydia was walking through Toronto's Market District with her mother when she stopped suddenly, staring at a construction site where workers were building a new commercial building. Clara, accustomed to her daughter's strange focuses, waited patiently. "Mama," Lydia said slowly. "That beam they're placing, it's going to fail. The angle is wrong for the load distribution. I can see it." "How can you see that, baby?" "Because..." Lydia paused, her hand moving through the air as if tracing invisible lines. "Because I can see the forces again. The mathematics. It's coming back." "Oh God, Mama, it's coming back." She started crying, but this time with relief and joy. The fog in her mind was lifting. The shapes and patterns she'd thought were lost forever were revealing themselves again, still there, just buried under trauma, waiting for safety and time to uncover them. The recovery wasn't instant or complete. There were still bad days when the mathematics eluded her, when memory of Brightwater overwhelmed everything else. But gradually, steadily, Lydia's abilities returned. Harrison resumed her education, carefully, gently, always letting her control the pace, never pushing when she showed signs of distress. And something remarkable happened. As Lydia healed, her abilities didn't just return to their previous level, they grew. The time away from mathematics, the experience of losing and regaining her gift, had given her a different perspective. She approached problems with new creativity, finding solutions that were more elegant, more intuitive than before. It was as if her mind had been reorganizing itself during the months of fog, making new connections, developing new pathways. By her 14th birthday in April 1898, she was working on mathematical problems that Harrison himself struggled to understand, venturing into territories where he could no longer effectively teach her because she'd surpassed his expertise. "I need to find you better teachers," he told her one evening, after she'd solved a problem in non-Euclidean geometry that had taken him 3 days to even properly understand. "You're working at a level that requires university instruction, possibly graduate-level instruction." "That's impossible," Lydia said simply. "No university will admit a 14-year-old colored girl. Maybe not officially, but there might be other ways. Let me ask around. See if any professors at the University of Toronto might be willing to work with you privately." He did ask around, carefully, discreetly, testing whether the academic community in Toronto might be more open-minded than their American counterparts. The responses were mixed. Some professors dismissed the idea out of hand, unwilling to waste time on a Negro child, regardless of her supposed abilities. Others expressed interest, but wanted extensive proof before committing time to such an unusual student. And a few, a precious few, agreed to meet with Lydia simply because they were curious, because the intellectual challenge of working with an exceptional mind outweighed their prejudices or social concerns. Professor Daniel Morrison was the first to take her seriously. He was 63 years old, nearing retirement from the University of Toronto's mathematics department, with a reputation for brilliance and eccentricity in equal measure. He'd published groundbreaking work on differential equations and had little patience for academic politics or social conventions. When Harrison approached him with the carefully edited story of a young prodigy who needed advanced instruction, Morrison's response was characteristically blunt: "Bring her round. If she's as capable as you claim, I'll know within an hour. If she's not, stop wasting my time." The meeting took place in Morrison's cluttered office, books and papers stacked everywhere, blackboards covered in half-erased equations. Lydia entered nervously, still uncomfortable around authority figures after Brightwater. Morrison barely looked at her, just gestured toward a chair and said, "Sit. I'm going to give you a problem. Take as long as you need to solve it." He wrote on the blackboard a complex problem involving infinite series convergence, the kind of question that would appear on a qualifying examination for doctoral students. Then he returned to his desk and began grading papers, apparently forgetting Lydia's presence. She studied the problem for perhaps 5 minutes, her head tilting in that characteristic way, her eyes tracking invisible patterns. Then she stood, took chalk, and began writing. Morrison glanced up occasionally, watching her work, his expression unreadable. When she finished, she set down the chalk and returned to her seat without speaking. Morrison approached the board, studied her solution for several minutes, checking each step. Then he turned to look at her properly for the first time. "How old are you?" "14, sir." "Who taught you this methodology?" "No one, sir. I just saw that if you restructured the series this way, the convergence became obvious." Morrison returned to the board, examining her work more closely. This is an approach I've never seen. It's valid, elegant even, but it's not in any textbook. You developed this just now?" "Yes, sir. The standard approaches seem too complicated." I thought there must be a simpler way, so I looked for it." Morrison was silent for a long moment. Then he returned to his desk, pulled out a sheet of paper, and began writing rapidly. When he finished, he handed the paper to Harrison. "These are the names of 4 other professors in this city who might be qualified to work with her in areas where I'm not expert. Physics, advanced algebra, theoretical mechanics, logic. Between us, we can provide her with education equivalent to what she'd receive in a doctoral program. But Mr. Miller, I need you to understand something. This girl is not just talented. She's genuinely exceptional. The kind of mind that appears maybe once in a generation, possibly once in several generations. She needs to be developed carefully, challenged appropriately, protected from those who would exploit her." "She's been exploited before," Harrison said carefully, uncertain how much to reveal. "We left the United States partly to escape that situation." Morrison studied him with sharp eyes. "I'm not going to pry into your past, but I will say this. Whatever her abilities, whatever her potential, she's a colored girl in a world that's hostile to colored girls. Even here, even in Canada, where things are theoretically better, she'll face barriers. She'll be dismissed, underestimated, excluded from opportunities that mediocre white men take for granted. If we're going to educate her, we need to be realistic about what her future holds. She can't publish under her own name without being ignored or mocked. She can't attend university officially. She can't pursue a conventional academic career. So the question becomes, what do we train her for? What's the end point of this education?" It was the question that haunted all of them. What was the point of developing Lydia's abilities if she had no legitimate avenue to use them? They couldn't publish her work without exposing her to exactly the kind of attention they'd fled. They couldn't send her to university without risking discovery. They couldn't let her build a public reputation without making her vulnerable to people like Thorne, who would see her as a threat to be neutralized or a specimen to be studied. The solution they developed was both practical and profoundly unfair. Lydia would continue her education, working privately with Morrison and his colleagues. She would develop her abilities, pursuing mathematical research at the highest levels. But her work would be published under Harrison's name, with him serving as a front, a respectable white male face that the academic world could accept. Lydia would be a ghost, the brilliant mind behind discoveries that others would receive credit for. When Harrison proposed this arrangement, Lydia was quiet for a long time. "So I do the work, and you get the recognition. Yes, it's unjust, and I hate it. But it's the only way I can see for your work to actually reach people who might use it, build on it, advance the field. If we publish under your name, it will be ignored or dismissed. If we publish under mine, it has a chance to matter. Will anyone know? Eventually, I mean. Will history know that I'm the one who actually did the work? I'll document everything. Every paper we publish, I'll keep records showing you're the true author. Someday, when it's safe, when society has changed enough that the truth won't destroy you, we'll reveal it. But that might not happen in our lifetimes." Lydia looked at her mother, seeking guidance. Clara's expression was pained. "Baby, I can't tell you what to do. This is your genius, your life. But I can tell you that invisible survival is better than spectacular destruction. If this is what it takes for you to do the work you love without being imprisoned or dissected by men who see you as a threat, then maybe it's worth it." "Will I ever get to just be myself?" Lydia asked, the question carrying the weight of everything she'd lost. "Will I ever get to stand in front of people and say, I solved this, I discovered this, I matter?" "I don't know," Harrison admitted. "I hope so. I hope we're building toward a world where that becomes possible. But I can't promise it." Lydia was 14 years old, already traumatized by captivity, already aware that her brilliance was both gift and curse. She made the choice that countless other brilliant people suppressed by systems of oppression have made throughout history. She chose invisible contribution over visible destruction. "All right, we'll do it your way. But Professor Webb, promise me something. Promise that you'll document everything. Promise that someday, somehow, the truth will come out. I don't need statues or fame. I just need someone someday to know I existed, that I wasn't just a ghost, that I mattered. I promise. And so began one of the strangest collaborations in mathematical history. Over the next 15 years, from 1898 to 1913, Harrison Webb published 17 papers in various mathematical and engineering journals, work that earned him a reputation as a brilliant and unconventional thinker. The papers covered topics ranging from advanced topology to fluid dynamics to theoretical mechanics, each one pushing the boundaries of existing knowledge, each one written in a distinctive style that emphasized visual and intuitive approaches to complex problems. What the mathematical community didn't know was that every one of those papers had been written by Lydia Johnson, working in a small apartment in Toronto, filling notebooks with ideas and proofs that Harrison would then transcribe and submit under his name. She would develop the core concepts, work through the mathematics, explain her reasoning to Harrison. He would write it up in formal academic language, add references and citations, navigate the publication process. They were a team, but an invisible one, with only one of them visible to the world. The mathematics itself was extraordinary. Lydia's 1902 paper on novel approaches to calculating stress distribution in complex structural systems would become foundational to modern structural engineering, though it would be credited to Harrison Webb. Her 1907 work on intuitive visualization methods for multi-dimensional mathematical spaces would influence the development of topology for decades, again under Harrison's name. Her 1911 paper on predictive modeling of fluid turbulence contained insights that wouldn't be fully appreciated until the development of chaos theory 50 years later, but history would remember it as Harrison Webb's work. She was brilliant, productive, contributing meaningfully to human knowledge, and she was erased. Her name absent from the historical record, her achievements attributed to someone else. It was survival, but it was also a kind of slow death, the gradual disappearance of identity in exchange for the ability to keep doing the work she loved. If you've stayed with me this far through Lydia's story, through her discovery and exploitation and escape and eventual anonymous contribution, I want to ask you something. How many other brilliant minds have been lost to history because systems of oppression made it impossible for them to be acknowledged? How many discoveries are credited to the wrong people because the real geniuses were the wrong color, wrong gender, wrong class? Subscribe to the Sealed Room because we're committed to uncovering these buried stories, to refusing to let brilliance be forgotten just because it appeared in people that society decided didn't matter. Tell me in the comments what you think about Lydia's choice to work anonymously. Was it the right decision? What would you have done? Your engagement helps us continue this work of historical recovery. But Lydia's story doesn't end with anonymous publication. Because in 1913, something happened that would force all of them to confront the question of whether silent survival was enough. Dr. Marcus Thorne published a book. It was titled The Question of Negro Intelligence, a Scientific Assessment, and it was designed to be the definitive statement on racial hierarchy, a comprehensive argument that Negro intellectual inferiority was biological, immutable, and scientifically proven. The book was 500 pages of craniometric data, intelligence test results, comparative studies, all building toward the conclusion that white supremacy wasn't a social preference, but a natural law supported by objective evidence. And buried in Chapter 7, there was a case study that made Harrison's blood run cold when he read it. The case of E.D., a cautionary tale of anomalous presentation. Thorne didn't use Lydia's name, but he described her case in detail. The 13-year-old Negro girl who had demonstrated apparently remarkable mathematical abilities. The examination at MIT. The subsequent detailed study that revealed the truth about her condition. According to Thorne's account, follow-up examination had shown that the girl's abilities were not genuine intelligence, but rather a form of savant syndrome, a narrow calculation skill divorced from real comprehension. He claimed that under controlled conditions, she had failed to demonstrate the abilities initially reported. He suggested that the original claims about her capacities had been exaggerated by abolitionist sympathizers seeking to manufacture evidence of Negro equality. He concluded the case study by noting that the subject had ultimately been institutionalized for mental instability, a tragic but inevitable outcome for individuals whose brains developed abnormally, producing isolated abilities at the cost of general dysfunction. It was a comprehensive lie, a rewriting of history designed to neutralize the threat that Lydia's existence posed to Thorne's theories. And because Lydia had disappeared, because she couldn't speak publicly to refute these claims, Thorne's version would become the official record. Future scientists reading his book would learn about the Negro girl who seemed brilliant but was actually damaged, who proved not that racial theories were wrong but that apparent exceptions could be explained away through careful analysis. Harrison showed the book to Lydia. She read the chapter in silence, her face unreadable. When she finished, she set the book down carefully. "He's erasing me, not just my name, but my existence as anything other than a cautionary tale. He's taking everything I am and turning it into evidence for what he wanted to prove all along. We can refute this. We can publish a response, explain what really happened." "Under whose name?" "Yours." "Then Thorne will ask how you know so much about this girl's case unless you were directly involved. Which would lead to questions about where she is now, which would expose us. We can't fight this without destroying ourselves. So we let him lie. We keep doing what we've been doing. We keep contributing, keep advancing mathematics, keep proving through our work that the mind behind it is brilliant. Maybe that's enough. Maybe the work matters more than the recognition." But the bitterness in her voice suggested she didn't entirely believe that. The truth was that Thorne's book hurt in ways that isolation and examination hadn't, because it was existential erasure, the claim that she had never been what she was, that her brilliance had been imaginary or fraudulent, that she was a cautionary tale rather than a revolutionary example. How do you fight that? How do you prove you exist when the system is designed to deny your existence? Over the following years, Harrison and Lydia continued their collaboration, continued producing papers, continued advancing mathematical knowledge. But something had changed. Lydia became more withdrawn, more isolated. She rarely left the apartment. She poured herself into mathematics with an intensity that bordered on obsession, as if trying to prove something to herself, if not to the world. Clara watched her daughter with growing concern. "She's disappearing," Clara told Harrison in 1916, 20 years after they'd fled to Canada. "Not physically, but in every other way. She's becoming nothing but the mathematics, like she's decided that if she can't be a person in the world, she'll just be a mind doing calculations. That's not living. What do you suggest? We've tried everything we can think of to give her a normal life while protecting her from exposure. I don't know, but I know this can't continue. My daughter is 29 years old. She's never had a romantic relationship because she's terrified anyone she gets close to will discover who she really is. She has no friends because friendship requires sharing yourself, and she can't share herself without risking everything. She's a ghost, and I'm starting to think that maybe dying as herself would have been better than surviving as nobody." It was a brutal assessment, and Harrison couldn't argue against it. In saving Lydia's life, had they condemned her to a different kind of death? The slow erasure of identity, the gradual disappearance of self. The question haunted him, and it was still haunting him on March 17th, 1918, when Lydia Johnson died of influenza during the great pandemic that swept across the world that year. She was 56 years old, worn out from decades of labor and worry, her last years spent watching her brilliant daughter fade into anonymity. Lydia, who remembered everything perfectly, would never forget her mother's final words. "Baby, promise me something. Promise me you'll find a way to be yourself. Even if it's dangerous, even if it means losing the work, you can't spend your whole life being someone else's ghost. Promise me." "I promise, Mama," but it was a promise Lydia didn't know how to keep. After Clara's death, something broke in Lydia. Or perhaps something that had been holding together through sheer will finally came apart. She stopped working on mathematics. She stopped responding to Harrison's attempts to engage her. She spent days sitting silently, staring at nothing, trapped in memories that her perfect recall wouldn't let fade. The trauma of Brightwater, the years of hiding, the erosion of identity, her mother's death, all of it accumulating into a weight that no amount of mathematical brilliance could solve. Harrison, now 58 years old and not in the best health himself, tried everything. He brought her books, proposed new problems, arranged meetings with Morrison and the other professors who'd worked with her over the years. Nothing penetrated the depression that had settled over her like fog. "Maybe," she told him during one of the few conversations she would still engage in, "maybe Dr. Thorne was right after all. Not about Negro inferiority, but about me specifically. Maybe I am an anomaly, a malfunction. Maybe my mind works wrong, producing abilities that don't fit anywhere, that can't be used for anything except causing trouble. Maybe it would have been better if I'd never been discovered at all. If I'd just stayed a cleaning woman's daughter, illiterate and invisible, living a small life that didn't threaten anyone. You can't believe that. You've contributed more to mathematics than most people who have full careers and public recognition. I've contributed anonymously under a false name while hiding from the world. What's the point? What does any of it matter if I don't exist?" Harrison had no answer, and he was running out of time to find one. His own health was declining, his heart condition worsening. The doctor had told him he probably had 2 years at most. What would happen to Lydia when he died? Who would protect her? Who would document her work? Who would remember that she was real? In the summer of 1919, Harrison made a decision. He wrote a detailed account of everything that had happened, from discovering Lydia in 1897 to the present day. He documented her abilities, the examination, the abduction, the rescue, the years of anonymous collaboration. He collected all of Lydia's original manuscripts, her notebooks full of mathematical derivations and ideas, proof that she was the true author of the work published under his name. And he sealed it all in a metal box with instructions that it should be opened in 1969, 50 years in the future, when presumably the racial climate would have changed enough that Lydia's story could be told without endangering anyone. He showed the box to Lydia. "This is your legacy. Everything you've done, everything you've been. Someday, people will know the truth." She looked at the box with hollow eyes. 50 years? I'll probably be dead by then. So I get to spend my entire life being nobody, and then become somebody after I'm gone. That's supposed to comfort me? It's the best I can do. I'm sorry it's not enough. It's never been enough. But I suppose it's more than most people like me get, so I should be grateful. There was no bitterness in her voice, which somehow made it worse. Just flat acceptance of injustice, resignation to erasure. In October 1919, Harrison Webb died of heart failure at age 59. His obituary in Toronto papers mentioned his work as a tutor and his occasional mathematical publications, noting that he'd made modest contributions to the field. It didn't mention that he'd been a professor at MIT, or that he'd sacrificed his career to rescue a brilliant child, or that the mathematical work he'd published was actually written by someone else. History recorded him as a minor figure, a footnote at best. After Harrison's death, Lydia disappeared. The few people who'd known her as Sarah Miller reported that she'd moved away, destination unknown. Morrison and the other professors who'd worked with her tried to find her, concerned about her welfare, but she'd vanished completely. Some thought she'd moved to another city, or perhaps died shortly after losing the one person who'd anchored her to the world. The metal box Harrison had sealed was placed in a safety deposit vault at a Toronto bank to be opened in 1969 as specified in his will. But in 1925, the bank underwent reorganization. Records were lost or misfiled. The box was eventually transferred to a storage facility, its original instructions no longer attached. It sat there for decades, forgotten, gathering dust alongside thousands of other unclaimed items. In 1969, when it should have been opened, nobody knew it existed. The truth it contained remained buried. And Lydia Johnson? What became of her after Harrison's death? For 90 years, historians who noticed the occasional reference to her case assumed she died young, another casualty of the brutal racial conditions of the early 20th century. But in 2009, a graduate student in Toronto, researching the history of the city's black communities, found something unexpected. A death certificate from 1963 for a woman named Sarah Miller, age 79, occupation listed as seamstress. No surviving family, no notable achievements recorded. Just another elderly black woman dying quietly, unremarked, unmemoried. The graduate student almost moved on, but something about the date of birth caught her attention. April 1884. That would make her 13 in 1897, the right age to match scattered references she'd seen about a Negro mathematical prodigy in Boston who'd vanished. She dug deeper, finding a few more records. Sarah Miller had worked various jobs over the decades: seamstress, cleaning woman, occasionally as a tutor for children in her community. She'd lived alone in a small apartment in Toronto's Ward neighborhood. She'd had no children, never married, lived quietly for 44 years after Harrison Webb's death. And then the graduate student found something extraordinary. Among Sarah Miller's possessions, auctioned off after her death to pay outstanding debts, was a trunk full of notebooks. Mathematical notebooks, hundreds of pages of calculations and proofs and theoretical work, all dated from 1920 to 1963, all written in a clear, precise hand. All containing mathematics that, when the graduate student showed them to her advisor, proved to be far ahead of their time. One notebook, dated 1947, contained work on information theory that paralleled and in some ways exceeded Claude Shannon's groundbreaking research published the following year. Another, from 1952, explored concepts in computational theory that wouldn't be formalized until the development of computer science decades later. A third, from 1959, worked through problems in quantum mechanics that were still being debated. Sarah Miller, elderly black seamstress, had been producing cutting-edge mathematical research in complete isolation for over 40 years. Research that no one would see, that no one would know about, that contributed nothing to the advancement of mathematics because it was trapped in notebooks in a trunk in an apartment where nobody thought to look for genius. The graduate student spent 3 years tracking down Sarah Miller's real identity, following fragmentary references, connecting dots across a century of deliberately obscured history. She found Thorne's book with its case study of E.D. She found scattered references to a Negro prodigy in Boston in 1897. She found Harrison Webb's publications and noticed the distinctive visual intuitive style that didn't match his earlier work before 1898. And eventually, she found the metal box, forgotten in a storage facility, containing Harrison Webb's full account of Lydia Johnson's life. In 2012, the graduate student, now doctor, Jennifer Morrison, published a book titled The Ghost Mathematician, The True Story of Lydia Johnson. It documented everything: the childhood discovery, the examination, the abduction, the rescue, the decades of anonymous collaboration, the final 40 years of complete isolation. It reproduced Lydia's mathematical work, analyzed her contributions, argued for her recognition as one of the most important mathematical minds of her era. The book won academic awards. It sparked discussions about hidden figures in mathematical history, about how many other brilliant minds had been suppressed or erased by systems of oppression. Universities held symposiums about Lydia Johnson. There was talk of renaming buildings, establishing scholarships in her memory, finally giving her the recognition she'd been denied in life. But there was also backlash. Some historians questioned whether Lydia Johnson had been as brilliant as claimed, suggesting the evidence might be exaggerated or misinterpreted. Some mathematicians argued that her work, while competent, wasn't revolutionary enough to warrant the attention it was receiving. And some simply dismissed the entire story as politically motivated revisionist history, an attempt to manufacture black achievement where none existed. The arguments that Lydia Johnson had spent her life trying to escape, the debates about whether her brilliance was real or imaginary, whether she deserved recognition or should remain a footnote, continued long after her death, exactly as she'd feared they would. Because here's the terrible truth about Lydia Johnson's story. She was real. Her abilities were genuine. Her contributions were significant. And none of it mattered because the system wasn't designed to acknowledge people like her. She could have been twice as brilliant, and it wouldn't have been enough. She could have solved every unsolved problem in mathematics, and it wouldn't have changed the fundamental fact that she was a black woman in a world that had decided black women couldn't be geniuses. So, what do we do with Lydia Johnson's story? How do we make sense of a life that produced so much brilliance and received so little recognition? How do we honor someone who spent their entire existence being erased? Maybe we start by asking different questions, not was she as brilliant as claimed, but how many others like her never had anyone to document their existence at all? Not did she contribute enough to deserve remembering, but what kind of world forces genius to justify its own existence? Not should we rename a building after her? But how do we dismantle the systems that made her invisible in the first place? Because Lydia Johnson wasn't an anomaly, she was a pattern. A pattern repeated thousands of times across history. Brilliant minds suppressed because they appeared in bodies that society had decided didn't matter. Black mathematicians, women, scientists, indigenous astronomers, working-class inventors, disabled scholars, queer artists, all the people who had to hide their brilliance or see it stolen or watch it be dismissed because they didn't fit the narrow definition of who was allowed to be called genius. Some of them, like Lydia, left fragments of evidence behind, enough for us to reconstruct their stories, to finally acknowledge their existence. But most of them are just gone, their names forgotten, their work unrecorded, their brilliance vanished as if it never existed, and that's the real tragedy. Not just what happened to Lydia Johnson, but what happened to all the others we'll never know about. So here's what I want you to take from Lydia's story. When you hear about someone being brilliant, being revolutionary, being exceptional, ask yourself, who's not in that conversation? Who should be there but isn't? Who got erased so that someone else could take credit? Whose genius are we still ignoring because acknowledging it would require us to admit uncomfortable truths about how our society works? Lydia Johnson died in 1963, 83 years after her mother watched her calculate impossible equations in her head and hoped it would lead to something better. She died alone, unremarked, having spent most of her life being nobody. Her brilliance survived in notebooks that sat forgotten for 50 years. Her story survived because one professor cared enough to document it and one graduate student cared enough to find it. But how many others didn't survive? How many brilliant children were broken before anyone noticed they were brilliant? How many extraordinary minds were convinced they were nothing special because everyone around them said so? How many revolutionaries died as ghosts? We'll never know. That's the horror of systematic erasure. It doesn't just destroy people, it destroys the evidence that they existed in the first place. Lydia Johnson existed. She was brilliant. She mattered. And the fact that we almost forgot her should terrify us into asking who we're forgetting right now. What do you think? Could Lydia have done anything differently? Should Harrison Webb have published the truth despite the dangers? Was anonymous contribution better than no contribution at all? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. This is the work we do here, recovering the voices that were silenced, the stories that were buried, the truths that powerful people wanted forgotten. And if you believe this work matters, if you think these stories need to be told, then subscribe, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and help us make sure that the Lydia Johnsons of history are finally seen. Thank you for staying with me through this long, difficult story. Thank you for caring about a brilliant girl who deserved so much better than what the world gave her. And remember, history isn't just what we're told.